And I think today's conference is incredibly timely. There is so much going on, isn't there, in the carers world at the moment. We're going to hear in a few minutes about all the developments in the care bill, which are crucial really in terms of introducing new rights for carers and consolidating rights. But that's really in a context of a huge number of changes going on which are impacting on carers' lives. So all the changes happening in social security as a result of the Welfare Reform Act, issues that are really affecting carers' finances, carers' ability to manage and have the financial security that they need. The significant changes happening in the health service, the start of NHS England, all the restructuring going on at that local level as well, and within the context of the economy, which is beginning to show what used to be called green shoots of recovery. I don't know if they still use the phrase green shoots, but actually we know that for many carers, life is increasingly difficult, increasingly tough, increasingly feeling that people are having to manage on their own. So to spend a day thinking about and learning from each other about the importance of research, the insight it gives us, the way it helps us develop better policy, better practice is incredibly important. And I really hope today that, as well as some really great presentations that we'll get from the speakers, an opportunity to share together and to discuss together and to learn from each other. Many of you will be very familiar with the results of the 2011 census, which showed, as we thought, that the number of carers in the UK is increasing, but particularly showed increases in particular age groups. For example, carers over 65 now, the fastest growing group of carers, about 1.3 million carers over 65 now, an increase of 35% since 2001. So particular groups within that very diverse carer population really increasing quickly. And I guess the other thing which I wanted to say, and was really borne out by your introductions, is that caring is a near universal experience, isn't it? Because many of us in this room either are carers or have been carers or will be carers in the future, or we may ourselves need to be cared for. And when we're thinking about the research agenda, the policy and the practice, and thinking about carers, actually we are talking about each other and ourselves and our future selves. And I think it's always worth remembering that, actually, that one's own personal insight and experience is also really valuable. And I hope those of you who want to talk about your personal experiences and take on this really do feel able to do that today, because it is important. And despite it being a near universal experience, caring really isn't talked about in the public domain maybe as much as we would want it to be. Because often to make real progress on an issue, it needs to have that kind of public salience, that political salience as well. And although I think over the years, not least through the work of Carers UK and Carers Trust and other organisations, the issue has got more prominence, we still have a way to go, actually, before people feel able to talk about their experience. Before, for example, people feel able to have an honest discussion at work about the fact you're trying to balance caring and work. People don't yet feel quite able to do that in too many cases at the moment. And it is, I guess, in research terms, maybe still quite a new area in some ways. And I was just reflecting back on the history of the carers movement and how it started. And it was started by a remarkable woman called the Reverend Mary Webster. I don't know if many of you know the start of the carers movement. And Mary was a Congregationalist minister. So she was quite a trailblazer, actually. This was in the 1950s. And at the age of 31, she had to give up the job that she loved, the vocation she had in many ways, in order to care for her elderly parents. She was 31, she had to give up the job she trained for as a minister to care for her elderly parents. And as she did that, she found her world begin to shrink. And she coined a term which is probably as powerful today as it was then. And she said it was like being under house arrest as a carer. She'd given up her work, she'd lost some of that outside contact, and she was very much just focused in on caring for her parents. And she thought maybe there are other women in the same situation as me. And she started to write to the national newspapers, describing her situation, saying, actually, if you're in this situation, write back to me. And she was inundated with letters, hundreds and hundreds of letters, primarily from women, saying, actually, I'm in exactly the same situation as you. And that was really the start of the carers movement. And later, she began to very cleverly influence politicians, both in the House of Lords and House of Commons, and built up really a head of steam around recognising the crucial, but at that time, unrecognised and unsupported role of being a carer. And by 1963, she'd begun to establish a charity which was launched in 1965 under the very catchy title of the National Council for Single Women and Her Elderly Dependents, which I'm pleased to say, we have changed the name since then, but that was the precursor to Carers UK, started by a quite remarkable woman who, really against all the odds, made what was then a very, very private issue a public issue. Now, Mary sadly died quite young. She died in her 40s, but her pioneering work has very much led to certainly the work of Carers UK and other organisations. And I wanted just to read a couple of quotes really from carers, just about the experience of caring, both around how it starts, but also what happens when you come to the end of that caring experience. Because actually, caring is all about transitions. It's all about taking on a different role, understanding what that does to the rest of your life, and potentially also thinking about what happens at the end of that caring role. So, 2 or 3 quotes. Nothing prepared me for the loss of identity that jumped me when I had to stop working. Overnight I stopped being Superwoman and became a non-entity, a scrounger living on benefits. I feel that I am invisible now. As soon as you mention that you're a carer, whether talking to a professional or a stranger at a bus stop, their eyes glaze over. Once you're a carer, it is as if you cease to exist, or only live as a shadow. It is hard. Another one who said, I don't get any help. I haven't had a holiday, a day off, a day out, or a lie-in for 4 years. I've gone from having an active social life to having none. Friends are not understanding when I have to cancel meetings at the last minute because Mum is ill. When I do go out, I have the constant worry something may have happened and the guilt of leaving Mum in the house alone. I find I'm very isolated. If I'd known before I became a carer what I now know, I would not have taken on the responsibility. Someone else who said, I rarely have conversations with anyone about anything other than my husband's health issues. I miss just having fun conversations. And at the end of caring, after my caring role ended, I felt out on a limb. You live in a bubble each day. You have a rough idea of what is ahead. Even when you know it's going to happen, it is a change in lifestyle, and it's very frightening, just as frightening as when caring begins. You feel lost and alone, and no idea what to do with your time. After caring long term, carers especially should be given time to grieve and get their head back in some sort of order. And I know many of you will have heard similar stories or will have experienced those things yourselves, but let's just keep some of those feelings and understanding at the heart of what we're going to talk about today. So, looking ahead today, we're going to start really with the setting around the public policy agenda and what's happening with the Care Bill. Now, when I got the draft programme for today, and it said Care Bill, Elaine, Edgar, Department of Health, and then it said NB, subject to not being summoned by MPs to discuss aspects of the bill. And that has been Elaine's life for the last year. Taking forward a bill through Parliament, I mean, I guess one of the most exciting but one of the most challenging things to do, because your time is not your own, And annoying organisations like Carers UK and others keep putting amendments down and trying to make Elaine's life more difficult. But it has been great to work with Elaine. Elaine is the policy lead at the Department of Health for carers, brings great understanding and depth of knowledge and experience to that. And it's a great way to start today, really, is to give the kind of public policy framework around what is happening and to hear the very latest on a really important piece of legislation, which is the Care Bill. So delighted to welcome Elaine.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thanks. Oops. I start off by getting myself my cardigan pinned down by a staple. And in fact, this is the bill is now in committee stage in the Commons, and so in fact I think so far in January, this is the first Thursday morning I haven't been at the House of Commons, and I'm on standby for this afternoon. So this has been beautifully timed to fit in with the bill. So I think I need to just can't move that on. Hopefully, I'm going to move. I might need some help in which. Well,
but can I not be on the camera, please?
Thank you. What I was going to do was just briefly go through some of the key features of the Care Bill, and particularly just talk about the ones which relate to carers. And I think if you're aware that at the same time that we're taking the bill through, we're also working on drafting regulations, which are the secondary level of legislation, and we're also drafting statutory guidance. So that work is also going on at the same time that we're taking the bill through Parliament. I'll talk a bit about the bill's progress and then the next steps around implementation, and then also touch on some of the issues which you may be interested in, which have been raised during the debates on the bill. Lots of amendments from Carers UK and others, which actually remain out of the bill, but you might want to know what the key issues are that have been raised, and again how those might be taken forward outside the legislative framework. So when we started off, it seems a long time ago now, probably 2 years ago, with drafting the bill. And firstly, we published it for consultation. It was then subject to what's called pre-legislative scrutiny by Parliament. So we had responses at 2 stages on what people thought of the bill before we even entered the parliamentary process. And I think that was very helpful. Interestingly, the Health and Social Care Bill in the previous year didn't have any of that legislative scrutiny, and I think they actually had a much harder time taking the health bill through than we've had with the care bill, though there still have been quite a lot of changes along the way. So these are some of the provisions which apply equally to carers as the people who need care and support. We've used the language. We've moved away from people having services, and we talk about care and support for carers. And one of the things, again, when we started off with the bill, we made a conscious decision to not to have a separate chapter in the bill on carers, but to embed them throughout the bill. So many of the provisions within the bill, they apply equally to carers and the people that they support. And so I've mentioned what I think are the key ones here. The bill starts off with the first clause of the bill is about promoting individual well-being. This has been very warmly welcomed by lots of people because it's an underlying principle to the bill that in all of the functions which are set out that in the bill that a local authority must do, they have to have regard to individuals' well-being, and that means that includes carers as well as the people they care for. There's also a clause about preventing needs for care and support, what I'd call early intervention. So again, a duty on local authorities to think about what they can do in community services, both for people who need care and their carers, and also look at ways of supporting people to reduce or diminish needs or delay needs for care and support. So how can we get to people at an early stage rather than waiting till people are in crisis situations? There's also provisions for promoting integration of care and support with health services, and that clause particularly mentions in terms of looking after people's well-being, prevention, and also the quality of care and support. Providing information and advice. There's a requirement in the bill that local authorities must establish and maintain an information and advice service, again inclusive of carers. Something which went in during the passage of the bill was a clause about independent advocacy support, and this is about where somebody who is unable to represent themselves in the discussions, for example, through during assessment or in developing a care plan, that the local authority is required to appoint an advocate. Now that's when there isn't anyone else who can act as an advocate, but that was something which wasn't in the bill when it started but has gone in during the passage. Promoting the diversity and quality in service provision, again a requirement on local authorities to develop the local care market, and again to look at what carers need in terms of support from care providers, the flexibility they need. Helena, you mentioned that people might not feel confident to leave someone, so it's actually how do you develop a service which families can have confidence in, that they can be confident it's reliable, consistent, of a good quality, so they actually trust that service to look after their relative when maybe they're at work or taking a break from caring. There's a requirement on local authorities and relevant partners, and the relevant partners include education services and health services, a requirement to cooperate both generally at a strategic level but also in individual cases where need be. And then there's also provision about personal budgets and direct payments, and again the if you like, the default position is that people will have a personal budget and opportunity to use direct payments where that makes sense. So there are, as I say, a lot of different provisions within the bill, and there are a couple of clauses which actually just relate to carers. So those have been my responsibility to take through the bill process, but I do get roped in for other things. So the provisions specifically for carers are about carers assessments, and then also the duty to support carers are particular provisions where the clause is just about carers. So if we start with the carers assessment, we have changed the requirement that a carer should be caring on a substantial and regular basis. So providing substantial care on a regular basis. So that has been removed in the bill, and instead the duty is to assess someone where there is an appearance of need for support. So that really is a lower threshold than the substantial and regular test. On the whole, we've incorporated the previous legislation about carers' assessments. So we've kept the focus on the outcomes that carers wish to achieve in their day-to-day life. We've emphasised this is also checking out whether a carer is willing and able to care and to continue to care. I think the previous legislation said something about checking whether a carer was able to care, and we have put in the willing word as well, because I think it's we had a bit of an argument with the lawyers who said if you say able, that includes willing, and we said, well, we didn't think it did. So we've actually said able and willing, both at the current time and in the future. There's a lot actually of description in the bill itself about what an assessment should cover, and in addition we will be making regulations which are the sort of secondary level of legislation to provide more information about what we think how the assessment should be carried out. So one of the particular things which will be setting out in regulation and also in the statutory guidance which will accompany the bill when it becomes an act, is around a whole family approach to assessment. Now, a lot of the discussions I had last summer were about young carers and how did they fit into the care bill. We've also had discussions about parent carers of disabled children and how do they fit into the bill, because the bill itself focuses on adults caring for adults. And so lots of discussions over the last year with Department for Education, and one of the what came out of those discussions is, rather than us putting something in the care bill about young carers and parent carers, we felt it was more appropriate for the framework of children's legislation. But what we did recognise was that when assessors are assessing an adult who needs care and support, it's very important that children in the family are considered, and if they are doing inappropriate caring tasks, or they are taking on an excessive amount of caring which is impacting adversely on their lives, that's something that adult assessors should be thinking about, and what is their role in preventing that inappropriate and excessive caring. So that aspect of a whole family approach to assessing an adult, whether they're an adult needing care or an adult carer, will be covered in regulations and more detail about that in guidance.
Is it possible to ask a quick question? And will that include some multiple caring responsibilities
Absolutely.
as well? So that can be recognised within, because that's often neglected at the moment.
I think you're absolutely right. And when we talk about a whole family, although the focus very much in discussions has been on young carers, I've been very clear we are talking about all members of the family, and it's not necessarily in the same household. You might be helping to look after a grandparent who lives in the next street or something. That needs to be teased out during the assessment of the adult who is caring. And if the child is at school during the day and isn't there, you still need to be asking those questions when a child is in the family. But also, as I say, what other people are doing in the family. There's something in the regulations about proportionate assessment. I'm sure lots of you in the room have heard people saying, well, the carer's assessment took an hour and actually at the end of it I didn't get anything. So there's something about, and there is a trick in this obviously, about trying to make an assessment proportionate but also making sure it picks up what it needs to pick up. But it isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach to assessment, and we've got quite a lot of conversations going on at the moment about, well, what should we be saying about that that point in both in the regulations and in the guidance about how do you make sure an assessment is proportionate. There's also provision within the bill to combine assessments with other assessments if all parties agree, and that's not to say assessing a carer's individual needs shouldn't happen, but if it makes sense to look at this in the round and people want that to happen, there's provision to do so. There's also the opportunity to combine a young carer's assessment under the Children and Families Act, will be an act, with an adult assessment. So there's something about making sure you have looked at the individual, but then look at that family holistically in the terms of what provision is going to be made. For the first time in law, carers will have eligibility for support, and there's also the duty to meet eligible needs of carers. So that has not been in the law before. It's been in the law for those needing care and support, but not for carers. So there's just one clause within the bill which says there will be an eligibility framework for both those needing care and carers. And again, most of the detail about that is going into regulations. Last summer we did circulate draft regulations as for discussion, and had quite a lot of comments back in on that, and those discussions are continuing. In fact, some of my colleagues at the department are in Birmingham today for a focus group, particularly looking at carers eligibility regulations. So it'll be interesting to find out tomorrow what the outcome of that was. But that will also be expanded in the statutory guidance. I think some of the issues that have come up when we're thinking about eligibility is how do you get things on a par between carers and the people they care for. Some people think we have been a bit more generous on the carers side, where with the eligibility. We've sometimes used different words, which I think was more, I don't think that was necessarily deliberate, but I worked with one set of lawyers in drafting the regulations for carers, and my colleagues worked with other lawyers. So sometimes we've used slightly different words. People have asked us what we mean by significant, and that's another issue. How do we define significant somethings? Because that's where we had been trying to pitch the eligibility threshold. And again, looking at some concerns have been raised about how do you support a family where, say, there is a young carer, but the adult who needs care doesn't actually hit the eligibility threshold. So what do you do in that sort of situation? So those are the sorts of the issues which have been raised, which we're still grappling with, and if anyone's got any solutions, be glad to hear them.
When does the discussion close?
Well, it did close last November, but we're continuing with various stakeholder discussions with ADAS and others. So very happy to have conversations. With the regulations, we will be, and the statutory guidance, we will be publishing those for consultation. There will be a 3-month consultation period. We're aiming to publish those in May of this year. And then it's got to be a fairly quick turnaround. We'll have a 3-month consultation, and then the intention is to publish the final versions, both of the regulations and the guidance, in October, ready for implementation next April. I mentioned, and again this is for the first time, there is a duty in the bill on local authorities to meet carers' eligible needs for support. So the word eligible is important because that means you've met the criteria. The bill stipulates that those needs can be met by providing care and support to the person being cared for, which I think is often a way that one can help a carer. Obviously, if that person agrees. But what is important, I think, is that the bill says that even if the person isn't eligible for support in their own right, so they're not hitting the eligibility threshold, if the impact of caring is such on the carer that they meet the eligibility threshold, then that care can be provided. Another thing which we put in, which I think has been welcome, is a recognition that quite often there is a difference of opinion between the carer and the person they care for about whether support is provided, needed. People saying, well, actually, my son, my daughter will do that for me. We don't need help. So there is another phrase I hear quite often is, my wife won't let anyone else in the house. So we put the next bullet point, we actually put provision in the bill to try and address that situation. Obviously, you cannot force care on someone who doesn't want to receive it. But what we have at least said in the bill is if the local authority encounters that situation, then as far as is feasible, it should look at another way of supporting the carer. So it's not just, well, we've offered some care, your wife won't accept it, you're on your own. So that I think has been welcome as another push to go one step further. Charging is an issue that has come up during the progress of the bill, and Helena looks guilty there. But we have kept the existing provision that a local authority has the power to charge for direct support to a carer if it chooses to do so. Most local authorities don't, and we're not expecting them to change that practice, but they have the power now. We were not going to take that power away from them. But what is very clear in the bill is that if care is provided to the person being cared for as a result of a carer's assessment, the carer must not be charged, and that is very clear in the bill. So there is no slippage that a carer is charged for care to the person they care for.
So care to the person they care for, does that include respite?
If it's the replacement care,
Yes.
that is provided to the person being cared for, and therefore
So respite is no longer a carer's service?
if something is provided to enable the carer to take a break, which might be paying for them to go on away for the weekend, you might have relaxation classes, whatever gives you a break from caring, that's a service direct to the carer. But if you look at the replacement care, if that's what is needed, that is a service to the person needing care, and that a carer cannot be charged for that. The person receiving the care may be charged for it, but the carer cannot be. Support plans. There's a clause in the bill about developing care and support plans for the person needing care, and we've called them carer support plans. So following an assessment, there is an entitlement to a support plan setting out how support will be provided and some help in deciding how eligible needs will be met. All plans will include a personal budget of what to meet the care needs, and where appropriate, it will set out where direct payments will be made. Again, care and support plans can be combined if both parties agree to that, and there's also a stipulation that plans must be kept under review. Again, during the discussions on the bill, we were asked to put in a definite time period for that, which we decided wasn't appropriate, because again, saying plans must be reviewed in a year might make sense for some people, but it doesn't make sense for others. And so we didn't want to develop a sort of bureaucratic system of saying plans have to be reviewed every 12 months. Where it makes sense for that person's plan to be reviewed, fine, but that's not the case for everyone.
Okay. Sorry, can I ask a quick question? Sorry. If the cared for person then refuses to pay for the replacement care, and everything is means tested to the cared for person, and they refuse to pay for it,
Well, that's when the local authority has discretion to meet those needs anyway and not charge anyone.
thank you.
But it's a discretionary power. Yeah.
But if the local authority says can't afford,
Well, that's
so then the carer can't have a break.
well. It then comes back, I think, to using the provisions are. Well, you must look at another way of supporting that person. So this is encouraging pragmatism, and I think we can explore this further in guidance. But
Because I can see that happening because I work on the ground, so I can see it happening.
well, I think it just depends on it's common sense, really, isn't it? If you can support a carer to keep caring, that actually is going to be more cost effective for the council than that carer collapsing. So I think this is where common sense should prevail, really. You could say common sense isn't always that common, but there we go.
Millions to say, yeah.
This, I think, the whole thing about the framework is that and again, one of the things we were keen to endeavour to do was not just to have a framework which is for austere times, but actually to develop a framework which would last for the next 20, 30 years. Resources are important, and that is a separate issue, but this framework should give local authorities to adjust to the resources that they have. Now, I'm not belittling the problem about resources, but the legal framework is something which should stand the test of time, and hopefully things are going to get better, but it wasn't just about developing a framework where resources are very tight, but it's endeavouring to give that flexibility to a framework which isn't just about resources.
Shall we just, if we take questions at the end of Elaine's presentation?
Okay.
We've got a few more slides to
Yes,
to get through.
indeed.
So if you,
Sorry.
Great questions, hold them, write them down.
Oh,
and
I'm
we'll
very
have a bit of time
happy
at the
to
end.
talk to people
Great.
later on.
Thanks.
Again, a welcome provision within the bill has been about preparing for adulthood, so the transition between children and adult services. And in these clauses, we have a duty to assess young carers in advance of their 18th birthday if they're moving into becoming an adult carer. Also, a duty to assess parent carers of disabled young people as the disabled young person moves into adult services, and also there's provision for a duty to assess the disabled young person themselves. So again, that's in all of this is endeavouring to tackle the legal barriers to that transition, trying to improve that shift from children's services to adult services, which so many people say it's like being on a cliff edge. You don't know what's going to happen. It's a very stressful time. So all of those provisions are intended to help smooth that path. And I said I'd talk a bit about the progress of the bill. It was introduced, it was in this Queen's speech last summer. It was introduced into the House of Lords to begin with, And as you'll see from that slide, it left the House of Lords in October. So we had the various stages of the bill. And as I mentioned before, we're now actually coming to the end of committee stage of part 1 of the bill, which is about care and support. And probably next Tuesday is probably going to be the last day for that. So we've just got some work to do on that. And then the next steps are what's called report stage and third reading. So then at the end of that, the bill will have been considered by both houses of Parliament. And then there's a sort of what's actually called ping pong. I didn't feel I could put ping pong on a slide, but this consideration of amendments by both houses is known as ping pong. So they go backwards and forwards to agree what the final version of the bill should look like, and then royal assent is sought. Hopefully we'll get that. We would say in the spring. Hopefully that's about March time. Then, as I've already mentioned, we're planning to publish for consultation the draft regulations and statutory guidance, final versions by October, and then local implementation of the new legal framework starts from April of next year. This slide you probably can't read, and I checked on the handouts as well. You probably need to get a magnifying glass out for that too. But this just really shows you that the primary legislation, the bill, is at the top of that pinnacle. Then we've got the secondary legislation, which goes into more detail, still legally binding, as is the statutory guidance. So all of those things have a legal status. But then right at the bottom, we got what we called practice guidance. So as well as looking at what should go in the bill, we're also looking at what good practice guidance would it be helpful to develop in the next year to support implementation of the bill. So we have some ideas. We're talking to stakeholder organisations, ADAS, LGA, lots of bodies about what would help, where are the gaps in the guidance. One of the things I've already identified and which we're hoping to commission soon is developing some good practice guidance on a whole family approach to assessment for adult assessors. I think there's been a lot of guidance produced on a whole family approach to assessment, but it seems to have been very much written from the children's end of it. And nobody's yet been able to say to me, oh, there's guidance for those who are assessing adults. So that's one gap we've identified. We're also talking about commissioning a sort of good practice pack, really, about that journey from a carer's assessment through to the care and support plan. Again, if people have ideas about where there is a gap in good practice guidance, we'd be very interested to know your ideas, and we can look at that as we in the round and in determining what should be commissioned to prepare in the next 12 months. So as I say, in parallel to taking the bill through, we are looking at implementation. There's a board which is overseeing implementation. That's supported by an implementation team. And again, we are, as part of all that work, we're saying carers is a cross-cutting theme. So all the various projects which have been set up under this programme need to consider carers as part of their work. So there's, for example, projects on prevention, on information and advice, on assessment and eligibility. Now, instead of us looking at carers separately, we're saying all of those projects need to look at carers as part of their work. And I flit between the various projects, trying to help them through that process. And just to end, I've got some links on the fact sheets about the care bill, the explanatory notes, the latest version of the bill, if anyone for some reason, wants to look at it. And I think the discussion document on eligibility, hopefully that's still on the website, although, you know, we said that was, we asked for comments by the end of November. And very briefly, if I just say a few things about the issues that have come up.
That would be great.
During the passage of the bill. As I mentioned already, young carers and parent carers came up, and we've had some long discussions with DFE colleagues, and the government did agree to amend the Children and Families Bill last summer to include an assessment of a young carer on the same footing as we have in the care bill for an adult caring for an adult. And just this week, and it's sort of hot off the press, the government has also agreed that it is going to introduce an amendment to the Children and Families Bill next week, putting parent carers assessments on the same footing. Hooray, yes. So we got there in the end. And that's been an interesting experience, I think I will say. The other thing which has come up a lot in the debates, both in the Lords and in the Commons, is about the NHS role, and particularly the NHS's role in identifying carers. Now, we have resisted putting a duty into the care bill on the NHS to identify carers. There is the prevention clause includes a duty on local authorities to identify carers in the population. If we go back to what I mentioned earlier, the cooperation clause and the duty on local authorities and its partners to cooperate with one another on the functions, we are saying that means that the NHS is required to cooperate with the local authority in its prevention duties. So that includes identifying carers. So we haven't put anything into the bill about a specific duty on the NHS, because in our view it is covered by the duties on the local authority and the duty on health bodies to cooperate with the local authority in the delivery of that function. But what I'd also say, and this is outside the work of on the bill, but last year NHS England they started an engagement exercise on carers to look at their commitment to carers, and they are working at the moment on developing an action plan on what NHS England will do to support carers, which again I think is very welcome. So this isn't legislative, but I think one of the key things that they will be looking at in developing that action plan is what is the NHS's role in helping people to identify themselves as carers, which is how I prefer to put it, rather than someone else saying you are a carer. It's helping people to recognise themselves as carers and then be able to access the information, advice and support which is available to carers. But if you don't think of yourself as a carer, then you're not going to start looking for that information. So I think we're going to be able to work closely with NHS England over the coming months to develop what they want to do about helping people better than that has happened hitherto, on helping to see themselves as carers. A lot of people don't want to be labelled as a carer, but at least signposting them to the help and advice that is available under that label of carer. So there have been some other issues raised in debate, but those are the main ones. So shall I stop there? I did see one hand go up in the middle as well. Helena.
Elaine, thank you ever so much. Really, really clear overview of a really important piece of legislation and very significant. And as you said, there are quite a few live issues, and the parent carer issue was literally the night before last, wasn't it? Sort of late into the night in the House of Lords. And I think what Elaine has talked about is not only the work that the Department of Health have been doing, but the challenge when you need to engage another government department as well. It's always the most difficult thing, isn't it, working across government to try and make sure that legislation is coherent across the piece. So I think the fact that the Department of Education have now responded on parent carers as they did on young carers is really, really important. I want to take a few minutes for questions. I just want to ask you one question to start with, really. You've been given a huge amount of time to the bill and to the work on carers. What are the outcomes for carers that you really want to see this bill succeed in? If you could say this is where you think this bill can take us when it's an act, what are the outcomes that you're hoping for?
Well, my phrase is mainstreaming carers, and I think it follows on from your opening remarks, Helena, that and that's why I'm very pleased that we have carers throughout the bill and not in a separate chapter, because that's what we discussed a couple of years ago. Should we have a separate chapter on carers? And I said, no, please don't do that. And we didn't go down that route. And the same thing, I think, in the throughout, that everything is, carers are mentioned where they need to be mentioned. If things are going to be exactly the same for carers as the people they care for, then that needs to be said once. If there are things which might be different for carers, we can expand on that in the various sections of the guidance, etc. But I really don't want us to be having people, sort of separate documents saying that, well, this is about carers and this is about the people they care for. If we can achieve that mainstreaming of and thinking about carers together with the people they care for, rather than as a separate entity, I think that would be great.
Great, thank you, Elaine. And I guess also, because one of the things is that one can come in and out of a caring role as well. And sometimes people have called it serial caring, which sounds slightly odd, but that notion that you can be caring maybe for elderly parents or a partner, and go through life with different sort of caring episodes, and that relationship also between the carer and the person they're caring for is often there's a mutuality around that as well.
Absolutely,
isn't there?
and in fact mutual caring roles, and also multiple caring roles. And I think it's also trying to get this fit for the well-used phrase, fit for the 21st century, so recognising distant carers as well as those who are in the same household. So trying to get away from that idea that there is one carer for one person who's needing care, and actually then looking at what's happening in different families, and hopefully focusing on the impact of caring on an individual, because that's, again, it's not going to be the same for everyone. So can we look at it from that point of view? What is caring doing to that person's life?
Okay, great. So, a bit of time for any questions. Anyone got any? Yeah. So we take 2 or 3 in a go. Is that okay? Do you mind saying who you are and then your question, and then?
And I shall write them down, because I will only remember one thing.
I'm Mary Buckman. I'm head of social care within a mental health trust. So straddling health and social care. So very interested in what you're saying about that there won't be a statutory duty placed on the NHS. And with my realistic, little bit cynical head on, I'm wondering whether the expectation will be spelt out in statutory guidance, or will come through the commissioners for individual NHS organisations to report on their carers.
I think that will come through. Sorry, I'm jumping to the question, but I think that's very much about what will NHS England be doing as part of their action plan. But interestingly, I've also been asked to help with rewriting the Code of Practice, the Mental Health Act Code of Practice, and embedding carers in that. So, again, throughout the document. So hopefully, with mental health, we will be shifting to that.
Okay, very quick answer. That's great. Thank you. Yeah. No, back. Yeah.
Two very quick questions. I understand that this is sort of consolidating legislation. Sorry, Caroline Jenkins, University of York. This is sort of consolidating legislation, bringing together, previous acts. will it include the reference which the 2004 Carers Act includes the taking account of carers' needs in relation to employment, training, leisure activities, which is very broad.
Yes,
So that's
yes.
the first question.
I wouldn't have dreamt of. I don't think we'd have got away with trying to lose that, but we didn't want to.
It will be there.
It is there.
The second thing is, the moment from our research, which we'll be hearing about shortly, current practice often appears to allocate money for respite care into the service users' personal budget, and that seems to be slightly inconsistent with the emphasis that the new legislation gives to treating carers as equal to the service user, with equal rights and equal rights to receive support. So it's about tidying up that issue about where the money goes to. In fact, some money that benefits carers goes to service users.
Great. Can we come back to that question and
Yes.
just take the other questions as well? So here.
Yes, thank you. I'm a member of the user carer practitioner group for this school and also a carer. My question, or I'm just raising attention to the statement on focus on outcomes carer wishes to
Mhm.
achieve in day-to-day life, as whether they are willing and able to carry on
Mm.
with care. And the other point about carers may be charged for support provided directly,
Mm.
although I know not necessarily so. I'm just thinking of many elderly people who are self-funders, and there's this conflict between, if you're a self-funder, often the family finances are grouped together with
Mm.
a married couple. And there's very much a conflict. I run a carers peer support group for carers of people with dementia. There's a real conflict with getting elderly people to face up to their own needs
Mm.
when actually they have to pay for it all the
Mhm,
time, and
mhm.
it is so expensive these days due to the introduction of personalisation, etc. And I'm just wondering what actually people who fund their care are really going to get out of this. I'm not being pessimistic
Mm.
because our authority is actually does a lot for carers, but this is a really fundamental issue
Mm.
when you're talking to the individual.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Got a question from here.
Mine was, in the guidance, is there going to be improved working between adult and children's services? Because if you're going to do whole family working, we've also got the children and family bill, that will impact on adult services. There needs to be guidance.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. And one question here.
Just a quick question. When the NHS and through GP surgeries are identifying carers, it tends to focus on physical care and physical conditions, and I didn't know how much this bill also recognised people who are caring for people with drug and alcohol problems, and also people who are parents of people with eating disorders, or even siblings of people with eating disorders. And you've already mentioned mental health, so I'm glad to hear that's being covered.
Great. Thank you. Good questions, Elaine.
Right. Well, I think that the thing about Caroline's point about respite, it comes back to, it seems to me, a rule of thumb is who is receiving that support. So if it is, say, a replacement care to enable a carer to take a break from caring, it could be, the situation could be that the carer might get a direct payment to do something, whatever it is they wish to do. It might be to purchase a laptop so they can keep in touch with friends and family. But if something is replacement care, then that is provided to the person who needs that care. It isn't provided to the carer. So that is why I think that replacement care would be an element of the personal budget of the person needing care. But if there is provision of something else, and Kirsty's nodding to me reassuringly, then that would be actually in the personal budget of the carer. So to be honest, I think most often it comes back to how do you support the carer. It is going to be looking at replacement care in a lot of instances for the person who needs care, and that would be it within, one would adjust that person's personal budget and their care and support plan to reflect that replacement care. It comes back to, really, I think you cannot force, if you like, that replacement care on an individual if they don't wish to have it. But that's where we get back to the sort of mediation, I think, in families as to what is needed. And I think sometimes mediation skills are needed, because people, either blithely think everything's okay and daughter, son can manage, and one needs those conversations within the family. And I think, again, on the charging, if there is then obviously there will be, again, regulations about charging, which you wish to look at. But that is, if there is a joint income, then that is regarded as there's a calculation to show how that income is seen as two individuals' income, and that is what is taken into account if there's assessment. But I think it does come back again to, is that working with families, as you say, if someone recognising they need help, and how best that can be provided. I don't know that one can put things in the law which will help with those family discussions, which often might involve the wider family and how they can support a couple. But as far as possible, we're doing the sort of what needs to be in the legal framework, and as much trying to make sure there aren't legal barriers to things happening. But it really then does come back down to practice, I think, of how things are managed. The other point about guidance between children and families and adult social care, and certainly we will be looking at our respective guidance. So DFE colleagues will be writing the guidance on the Children and Families Bill, we'll be writing the guidance on the Care Bill, but I can assure you we will talk to one another, share drafts, and make sure they join up. But again, I think it's quite important that we make sure it's embedded. If we're talking about what needs to happen to support young carers, it's embedded in both sets of guidance, because rather than it's something which comes out of those main bits of guidance, because my concern would be then people don't read that. We need to make sure it's in both the guidance on the Children and Families Bill and our bill. And then the Care Bill is very much about adult social care, and that's the focus of the bill. So I think if people have particular conditions, it depends if they're actually going to fall into the criteria for adult care and support by adult social services. But I think what I'd go back to is the provisions within the bill about integration of health and social care. And again, there's as well as the legal provisions, there is a lot going on at looking at how we can improve integration between health and social care services. There's something which has been set up called the Better Care Fund, and so money is going into that from April 2015, which is specifically to be used to assist that better coordination between health and social services. It's one of the biggest issues that my minister Norman Lamb is interested in. Integration and actually mental health are two of his very hot topics, and so he's pushing very hard on integration. So I think it's not just what's in the bill, but what's going to happen in the next couple of years to improve that integration between health and social services, which would include better working between GPs, acute hospital sector, mental health hospitals, as well as adult social care. So how do we join up all these different bodies?
Elaine, thanks ever so much for answering all those questions and for giving us such a clear run through of the bill. It strikes me as a huge challenge around implementation, isn't there? If you think about the changes that are happening and some of those areas where the kind of children's services and adult services need to work together, some of those knotty issues like charging, which we do disagree on, but I won't use Chair's prerogative to have another go.
Thank you.
You said that you hope common sense will prevail.
Well, indeed.
So do I, but I know us and other carers organisations will be watching like hawks to see how that goes. But there is a lot in the bill that is very positive, and I think Elaine's comment about this is a bill that's written not just for now, when we're in a time of austerity, but actually a framework that hopefully will last for 10 or 20 years is really, really important. And I have to say the way in which Elaine and colleagues have engaged with the carers sector, with other organisations, has really been good. So it does feel that we've been able to influence that process and hopefully improve it with you. Thank you again, Elaine.
Sure.
Hopefully you can stay for coffee. And
Yes, I can stay till lunch.
Fantastic.
Funnily enough, I'll eat the lunch and then I'll disappear.
I that's reasonable. I
That's
think
all right.
Elaine absolutely should get lunch after that. Can I ask you just to thank Elaine again
Thank you.
for a great session?